First up, we have What's Your JAMstack by Amberley Romo, Yarn Emoji Ambassador for Gatsby. Welcome, Amberley.
Gracias. He asked me earlier how I wanted to be introduced, and I jokingly said Yarn Emoji Ambassador, because it's probably one of my favorite things I've ever done is write a proposal to Unicode to get the yarn emoji, which is in Unicode now. Thank you. Yeah. Can y'all in the back hear me okay? Am I talking in it? Yeah? Okay, cool. Thanks. So, hi, everyone. Is everyone awake? Good break? Yeah? Cool. I'm going to talk today about the awesome ecosystem evolving around the JAMstack. And I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to carry on this proud tradition of dad jokes that have been going on today, but I am going to do some tasty metaphors. So that's all I have to offer you guys. And I'm really not sorry about it. So my name is Amberley. I currently work at Gatsby, helping to build out things for the Gatsby ecosystem. Many of you know Gatsby is a free and open source framework based on React that helps developers build blazing fast websites and web apps. I live in Austin, Texas, and I'm on Twitter, if you also like Twitter, Amberley with a 1 for the L, obviously because I'm super elite. Anyone? No. So, boom, the JAMstack, what we're all here for. You have the J, where dynamic needs are handled by JavaScript, agnostic of framework or library. You have the A for APIs. We've seen the unbundling of the CMS that a lot of people today have talked about, where we can pick and choose purpose-built services based on our needs. And we have the M for markup. We're serving pre-built static markup. So today I'm going to focus mostly on the J and the M in this JAMstack sandwich, and the vibrant ecosystem of projects and tooling that have emerged to sort of tie the JAMstack together. So why the JAMstack? And this will be brief because I know in many of the talks today we've heard about the benefits of the JAMstack, but humor me for a minute. More performant. If it's pre-built, you avoid spending the time rendering on the server, and pre-built files served over CDN are delivered super fast. It's more secure. With just static files, you minimize your attack vector. It's less expensive. Hosting of static files is cheap or even free, and you have less overhead with not needing to maintain your own servers. Better dev experience. You can focus on the front end without being locked into this monolithic architecture. And easily scalable. So serving static files, you don't have to worry about scaling up servers in response to increased load. So that all sounds super legit and really rad, but okay, where do you go from there? We heard Matt talk earlier about this shift from to the front end as the king or queen, from the monolith as the king or queen. But the freedom of breaking out of a monolithic CMS comes with a really overwhelming number of choices and decisions that you have to make. Where do you start? I definitely felt this way when I started learning React years ago. Because the tooling and the environment setup all around it was really demanding, even just compared to learning, even more so than learning React. So this brave new world of development comes with this whole new class of concerns and questions. So say you never baked anything in your life. This, to me, would be like me telling you, make a cake. Not giving you any ingredients, not giving you a recipe, not giving you any measurements, not telling you what kind of cake to make, just saying, do it. Well, I know there's flour and sugar and butter. Over in JAMstack land, I know there's JavaScript and APIs and markup, right? This would take some time to experiment with and figure out on your own sort of your ideal workflow and how you want to do this. Which leads me to this, the vibrant JAMstack ecosystem and sort of how to evaluate it and how to make sense of it. There's such a rad ecosystem of tools out there, and it's been really cool to watch the space develop, especially over the last couple years. And all of these different frameworks and tool sets, by necessity, have differing opinions. what languages to use. Jekyll uses Ruby, and we heard the Citrix team talking about their Jekyll project. Jekyll was my first static site generator, myself. Hugo uses Go. And they fall on a scale between fully static to, as Tanner talked about, something more like static progressive. They prioritize different things for optimizing for performance. Some have a ton of structure, some have more flexibility and less structure. But they're all different recipes, all different takes on the JAMstack. So now we're accidentally sort of back to the problem of having an overwhelming, sort of daunting number of choices. So I'll ask you a different cake question. What characteristics do you value in a cake? It has to have the flavors you want, it has to have the texture you want. Maybe you're super focused on the decoration and the presentation, but it still has to taste good. Or you don't really care about how it looks, you just want it to taste good. It's your cake, your choice. So instead, what characteristics do you value in a website or a web app? It's got to be fast. Time is money for users. It's got to be performant. You don't want to be unnecessarily costing users tons of data. You don't want to be excluding people. It has to be accessible. It has to have well-conceived content. It has to be easily maintainable. Maybe it needs to be in a certain stack most of your team is already comfortable with, so you don't have a big ramp-up time. So all of these questions and how they're prioritized depend on your project needs, your priorities, your business requirements, etc. The reality is we only have so much time. Personal time for personal projects and budgeted time for paid projects. So all of these wants and requirements are really sort of dials that we have to balance to stay within whatever our budget is. Some core concerns that I think are important when evaluating frameworks with different varying strengths and weaknesses are how they approach performance, what methods they use toward performance, how they approach accessibility, how they manage content and data, what the developer experience looks like, and the community around the project. So identifying your own core concerns and how they align in your priority set is sort of step one in evaluating what tool might be your best option. And I'll reiterate again, frameworks by necessity have varying levels of structure and opinion and flexibility. Depending on your needs, you need to have enough flexibility not to be constrained, but you also need to have enough structure that you can get going productively and not sort of have this indecision paralysis. So in talking through this set of core concerns, I'm going to talk about Gatsby specifically as an example, but I think this is a useful thought process to go through when comparing all of the available tools. So performance. Optimizing for performance involves considering payload optimization, like reducing image and JavaScript load, deferring below-the-fold image calls, inlining critical CSS, and delivery optimizations, like serving static files from a CDN. The good news is these approaches are complementary. But the bad news is, in order to do it well, you often have to do both, which takes a lot of time and specialization and focus. So again, different frameworks are based on different approaches to performance and different levels of focus in prioritizing performance. I'm going to talk through a few key pieces to how Gatsby approaches performance. First, route-based code splitting. We create smaller bundles for specific routes and shared bundles for common code. It allows us to fulfill only what the user needs at the time they need it. And Gatsby takes care of this under the hood by default. Use HTTP2 to serve assets. Aside from being a mouthful, HTTP2 is a major revision of the HTTP network protocol. It leaves the semantics of HTTP intact, but modifies how the data is formatted and transported between the server and the client to make the request-response cycle more efficient. In HTTP1, the cycle looks something like this. Here, the first request is for an HTML file. The server responds with the file, the browser parses it, and as it discovers other references to things like style sheets and scripts and images, it'll separately fire off those requests. Using HTTP2, instead, multiple HTTP requests can be sent and received via a single connection. So again, here we have our initial index.html request that gets returned, and again, as the browser goes through and parses and discovers these different references, it can request and receive responses, but this time on the same connection, so it's a little bit more efficient. And then further, HTTP2 enables server push, which will let us send site assets to the browser before it even knows it needs them. So in this scenario, again, firing off a request for index.html, but this time our server is intelligent enough to know that it should just go ahead and push and fire off these different assets that we've already told it we're going to need. So cutting down on that cycle time. If you're using Netlify to manage deploying a Gatsby site, you can use the Gatsby's Netlify plugin to take advantage of HTTP2 and server push critical Gatsby scripts by default. So 3, set up background prefetching. Prefetching uses browser idle time to prefetch resources a user will definitely or likely need in the near future. There are different ways to do this. There's predictive prefetching, which Tanner mentioned this morning, which uses analytics to enable prefetching based on a user's likely behavior, based on the way users have interacted with your site in the past. And another is to observe the user's interaction with the page and react accordingly, which is sort of how it works in Gatsby. Gatsby has a link component for internal routing that enables prefetching. And for that link component, there are sort of 2 pieces to how that works. First, we use the intersection observer API, which is a browser API that's used to perform some action when an element enters or leaves the viewport. This is an example of visualizing the intersection observer API. You can see as I'm scrolling up and down the page, as elements enter and leave the viewport, the emoji change based on whether they're coming into view or in view or leaving the view or hidden. So in Gatsby on load, if a link is in the viewport or above the fold, prefetching will be triggered for that route. If a link enters the viewport on scroll, resources for that route will be triggered for prefetch as well. These prefetch requests are heavily deprioritized and will only fire when the browser is idle. We sort of politely hint to the browser that these are resources that will likely be needed in the near future. But when a user actually actively hovers over a link, which strongly indicates that they'll navigate to that route, will actually fetch resources at a higher priority. So here, circles back, I'm on the Gatsby homepage, and as I hover over the nav items, you can see these requests reflected in the network tab in this cascade of requests. So by the time I'm actually clicking on in this case, the tutorial page, the resources that we need for that route are already loaded, and it feels super snappy. 4, lazy load non-critical assets. Lazy loading is a technique that puts off loading of non-critical resources at page load time, instead loading them only when they're needed. A great example of this in Gatsby is the Gatsby image component, which is designed to work with the Gatsby data layer to optimize images and image loading on Gatsby sites. This is a screenshot of the demo site for Gatsby image. And as you scroll, an intersection observer fires, and you actually load needed images in place, which you can see again in this cascade of requests in the network tab. It also optimizes images by default at build time, because optimizing images is low-hanging fruit for performance and should be easy in default. So with Gatsby image, you not only get image optimization by default, you're not even serving optimized images if they're not needed by the user. 5, use a service worker. A service worker is a web worker that runs in the browser separately from the main thread. It essentially allows your site to act as its own network proxy for requests. So for example, if you're loading a route that requires an image, the service worker can sort of act as a middleman and say, well, do I already have this image cached? And if it does have it cached, it can go ahead and return it to you and forego making that redundant request. If it doesn't have it, it can go ahead and send for it, get it back, cache it, return it to you. That way, if and when you need the image again, at that point, it's not making a redundant request. So doing this can speed up the loading and rendering of pages considerably. And in Gatsby, for adding a service worker, again, we turn to the plugin ecosystem. The offline plugin adds drop-in support for making a Gatsby site work offline and more resistant to low-quality network connections. It creates a service worker and loads it in the client for you. This plugin works best with the manifest plugin, which, when used together, get you most of the way toward fulfilling the baseline requirements for a progressive web app. All of this might be adding up to sound a little bit familiar if you're familiar with the purple pattern, which Gatsby follows. This is a pattern that was coined by the Google Polymer team and is essentially a methodology for building web apps that load quickly and reliably. You push the resources you need to get interactive and render the initial route quickly, and then use a service worker for caching and pre-caching resources, and then lazy load routes that you need on demand. 6, only ship live code. If the user doesn't need it, don't make them download it. With tree shaking, you identify code that's not being used so that you can eliminate it. In Gatsby, we use Webpack and Cursor.js for this. In the build process, Webpack will mark the unused code, and Cursor will eliminate it during the minification process. 7, serve static files. We're here at JAMstack Conf, obviously, so we've heard today about the benefits of serving static assets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Gatsby leverages static assets. When people think static assets, it might be reasonable to think, well, I can't have a static site because I want my site to be dynamic. But static assets don't mean a static app. Gatsby server-side renders at build time, producing static HTML. When a user hits a Gatsby site, they're initially served that pre-rendered static HTML. After that initial static load, the site is rehydrated into a React app, much like what you heard from Tanner this morning. So you get fast subsequent page loads and all of the benefits of single-page apps on top of a really fast initial static render. So I've talked about some of the main approaches Gatsby takes to baking in performance, and it's basically in service of this idea that we don't have to re-engineer setup or optimizations for a highly performant baseline. We don't have to fully reinvent our own recipes from scratch every time. And again, I'm using Gatsby as an example and the tech that Gatsby is built on. But if you have love for Vue.js or some other stack, there's something out there, like Nuxt and VuePress. So whatever it is, there's a running start out there in the ecosystem that aligns with your needs for flexibility and structure. The next core concern, accessibility. The same way we just talked about baking in performance for a head start, we can consider how we can do the same for accessibility. And again, bake in what you can. When you navigate on a traditionally server-rendered site, the previous page is fully torn down, and the new page is reloaded. And in response to this, a screen reader can announce the new content in a predictable way. Single-page apps, on the other hand, re-render in the client, which makes for a faster, more seamless visual experience, but can produce a broken experience for screen reader users. So without the page reload, if we haven't properly managed focus in a manual way, they won't know that new content has been loaded to focus or to announce to the user. In Gatsby's version 2, we switched to using Reach Router, which prioritizes accessibility as a first-class concern. And it provides out-of-the-box focus management for client-side apps. So I'm going to repeat myself a tiny bit here, But when you visit a Gatsby site, a static server-rendered HTML page is loaded first, and then the JavaScript to hydrate the site into a web app is loaded. From there, again, internal routing is handled with the Gatsby link component. But that link component actually wraps ReachRouter's link component. So using ReachRouter, we can bake some of these concerns more straight in. Also leverage linting tools. Just like you probably use linting to guard against human error and enforce consistent code style and code bases when you're working with a team or even by yourself, you can use linting to avoid some common accessibility pitfalls, at least the ones that are programmatically identifiable. So Gatsby Core uses the ESLint configuration that is used and put out by Create React App, which is Facebook's tool to get started with creating a React app. That configuration uses rules from the JSX A11Y plugin for ESLint, which checks accessibility rules on JSX elements. So during development, the linter will give you accessibility warnings to address and resolve as you go. Again, because accessibility isn't a feature, you don't add it at the end. You can lean on your tools, like linters and editors and stuff, to give you hints and address those issues as you go. So on the Gatsby team, we're constantly looking for ways to improve education and raise awareness through our docs, our available learning materials, for people to build accessible experiences for the web. And as a team, we're also continuing to evolve our approach to accessibility, both in the core tooling and what we put into the wider Gatsby ecosystem. So the team has been working on drafting Gatsby's accessibility statement, which was led by Marcy Sutton. So the initial draft, this right here, was merged on Monday, yesterday, which I'm really excited about. So y'all should all check it out. So as the statement says, we want everyone who uses Gatsby to feel welcome and find the experience rewarding. This includes developers with disabilities and users with disabilities for Gatsby sites, docs, and resources. Next core concern, managing content and data. Again, we talked about this earlier, monolithic CMSs are being replaced by these modular specialized content systems, and nowadays your data can come from anywhere. You can't tell just by looking at a site, but earlier we talked about the A in JAMstack, this proliferation of specialized purpose-built tools exposed in APIs. We do things like pull in search from Algolia because Algolia prioritizes it and is really good at search. Or pull in assets from Cloudinary because Cloudinary is really good at managing assets. Or pull in content from Contentful or Sanity or any of the other headless CMSs because they're purpose-built to manage content. We pull in stuff to manage our commerce from Stripe or Shopify because that's what they were designed to be good at. So again, we don't have to reinvent or re-engineer a lot of these things, but we should be able to use them all together in ways that are sane and manageable. The term we're using to describe this shift is the content mesh, which is the infrastructure layer for a decoupled website, the decoupled monolith. The content mesh stitches together content systems in a modern dev environment. So again, this allows you to select purpose-built, tailored solutions for distinct use cases and provides a modern framework for rapid iteration. And it empowers developers while preserving content creators' flows. So in this scenario, Gatsby is the glue for the content mesh. Gatsby can consume data pretty much from anywhere, and when you source data into Gatsby, it gets normalized into the Gatsby data layer using GraphQL. We use GraphQL because we think it's uniquely well-suited to serve as this integration layer between the data and your presentation layer. So after all this is said and done, all of your data is consolidated into this uniformly queryable layer. Or not. You can also handle data outside of Gatsby's data layer and just use it directly, which may sometimes be a good option for prototyping or getting your feet wet with Gatsby, or if you just don't want to use GraphQL. Next core concern, developer experience. When you're developing, you want to get productive fast, whatever that means to you. To me, that means a tool that enables me to use a modern stack without having to reinvent the wheel. To me, it should absorb the overhead of setting up an environment from scratch and take that off my plate. With Gatsby, that looks like React, Webpack, GraphQL, ES6 support, etc. Along with that, it should provide optimized builds out of the box. With Gatsby, you don't have to tune your own Webpack config, set up code splitting, manually optimize images. Instead, you start with an optimized baseline with the opportunity to customize or break out of those defaults by choice selectively where you need to. You should also be able to leverage the collective work of the community. With Node.js and NPM and Yarn, the JavaScript world has a really rich shared ecosystem. And on top of that, in Gatsby, there's this amazing community of plugins and starters, and more recently, experimentally, Gatsby themes. So, Brandon summed this up well, I thought. A great developer experience is one that you never have to think about. It just gets totally out of the way and lets you focus on building your product. And the last core concern, community. One of Gatsby's core values is you belong here. Everyone belongs in open source, and Gatsby is dedicated to making contributors feel welcome to contribute. We talk pretty much every day about how to make open source more inclusive and inviting for the community as a whole, because we believe it brings out the best in all of us. So we make a conscious effort to build this philosophy into everything that we do. From an open core maintainers meeting where community members can come share stuff that they're working on or problems that they're running into, give the core team feedback, and then they can also hear from the core team about what's new and what's in the works. To offering pair programming sessions with community members, to thanking each contributor with some swag and an invitation to join the Gatsby GitHub org, to an open and inclusive code of conduct and beyond. So tech doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's made for humans, and we believe we should strive to be excellent to each other in the course of making software. So over 1,800 people have contributed to the Gatsby monorepo, and there are now almost 800 plugins. So the plugin ecosystem is growing crazy fast thanks to contributors publishing and maintaining plugins. Again, we try to foster a community of giving back. Did you build something really cool that other people would get some utility out of? Awesome. Publish it, share it with the community. So I've talked about these core concerns. When getting started on a project, you have to evaluate and prioritize your core concerns and the time and budget that you have allotted to determine which tool fits best with that priority set. From performance methodology to how it approaches and prioritizes accessibility, to the tack it takes in how you manage content and data, to the overall developer experience and how it jives with how you like to work, to the community around the project. I really personally think it's a really awesome time to be a dev. And I really love Gatsby. We're using it to build a ton of things. We're using it to run our swag store, which is a full-blown e-commerce site. We're using it to run our .org site for everything in the Gatsby open source ecosystem, from docs to filterable, searchable libraries for plugins and starters. We're using it to build our first commercial offering, a hosted Gatsby preview service for teams. So it's an incredibly robust and flexible framework, and I really have a lot of love for it. But I also have a lot of love for the vibrant ecosystem of frameworks that have blossomed in the JAMstack space as a whole. And I urge all of you to explore all of the awesome recipes and flavors that the JAMstack universe has to offer to see what aligns with your core concerns and preferences. So, Gatsby is my JAMstack. What's yours? Thanks.